Tears turn to laughter, that child long ago. My soul starts to linger, it's home I know. If you catch me daydreaming now and forever, thoughts are carrying me alone to that place we call home. Down that long road, throughout life we roam. Whenever I go to that place I know, it'll always be home, home to me.
It was the spring of 1883. The steel rail highway was being blasted through the Precambrian shield along here when CPR blacksmith Tom Flanagan found something like this and thought he had discovered gold. Well, it turned out that Flanagan's find had been recorded earlier. Ore, rich in nickel and copper. It was to decide the future of the Sudbury region. Along with the railway, the rock has shaped just about everything around here, from industry to the layout of the community. And I think it has had a lasting influence on the people who were drawn from all parts of the world and decided to make this their last stop. Bush flying is something Bob Merrilees likes to do. Earlier in the 1900s, pilots like him, flying Wacos and Beavers and Norsemen, were the lifeline to the many remote areas of the North. Exploitation of minerals and timber created the boom that gave rise to operations like Austin Airways, Canada's first airline. It was based here on Ramsay Lake, in the heart of Sudbury, Ontario. The routine of today is more tempered, flying tourists and supplies into wilderness camps. Completing his run, Bob is returning home. Scientists believe that at one time, a meteor hitting the Earth created a mineral-laden formation we now refer to as the Sudbury Basin. In this elliptical-shaped dish today are a number of small communities: Coppercliff, Walden, Capreol, Nickel Center, to name a few, that together with the larger center of Sudbury comprise the region. The 155,000 population is partially employed in a growing service, administration, and education sector. But resource companies like Inco and Falconbridge continue to be the economic backbone of the community. Tracing its roots, David Pearson of Laurentian University.
To go back to the beginning, you have to go back to 1856 when the Geological Survey was up in the area. A fellow called Alexander Murray was the officer of the Geological Survey who, in his report for the summer activities of that year, recorded on a map the presence of iron pyrite, iron sulfide. But nothing happened. It's partly because Sudbury was very isolated in those days, and partly because the amount of copper of the mineralized outcrops was not sufficiently high for geologists to be interested, prospectors to be interested.
Activity came alive when American entrepreneur Thomas Ritchie, aboard the inaugural run of the CPR, spotted the ore samples and quickly sent them off for analysis. By 1884, backers organized to make money available for mining development and provide incentive in the search for mineral outcrops. They formed the Canadian Copper Company.
And that name tells us, as well as the way that the first ore samples were looked at, tells us that what people were looking for was copper. They weren't looking for nickel. In fact, when those samples were sent by Ritchie for sort of trial smelting, if you like, they encountered the same problems as had been encountered in Sweden a couple of hundred years before, when nickel was first recognized and first given its name. It was given the name nickel from the term Old Nick, the devil, because it interfered with the separation of copper from ore. And in fact, the trouble that nickel gave only turned into a benefit when the First World War came along, and some work that had been done by metallurgists in the United States had shown that nickel combined with iron in steel provided very good protective properties for battleships. In other words, it made good armor plate. And actually that discovery led the US Navy to be interested in making the alloy that included nickel, which led to Sudbury becoming a prominent nickel mining camp.
With the opening of the first mine in 1886, named after the Murray brothers, Thomas and William, and a smelter 2 years later, the foundation was laid for an industry whose fortunes would be tied to the war economies of the 20th century. International Nickel Company evolved out of the Canadian copper outfit and became the main employer in the frontier mining camp. Sudbury was soon to pride itself with a workforce determined to build a community on the immovable rock. Spike Hennessy.
It's my judgment that the people who chose to come and work in a mine in relatively unpleasant working conditions compared to many others on surface for higher wages was a kind of a selective process. We ended up with the kind of people who don't mind hard work and want to make big money.
At the turn of the century, hard work in exchange for a future was more than a fair bargain for people coming from Eastern Europe. Many had bought the offer of free land promoted by the Laurier government's immigration scheme. But as Mary Stafura describes, fate would open another door.
There were many, many groups going west, and it got to the point where Sudbury became their last stop before really going west. So we have stories of people coming into the station, and because there were already people here, asking them, where are you going? And they said, out west. Oh, no, you get off here. There are enough of us here. We've got jobs here. And that's what they would do. They'd just literally get off the train and stop in Sudbury. This immigration was unskilled and for the most part illiterate. They worked very, very hard, and the statistics of fatalities were terrible, 5 times that of British coal miners for that same period. And, well, you could imagine somebody going in, not being able to speak the language, and all he had was a candle in his hat. Anything could happen. And certainly not even, he couldn't take orders. I suppose they showed them what to do, and they went into these open pits and did the best they could.
The CPR that monopolized the original community, a grouping of shacks and gang houses, moved westward early in the 1900s, taking its rail worker population with it. But left behind was its indelible stamp.
Sudbury was established as a division point when the Canadian Pacific Railway was built. The people who did the planning or engineering for the railway company, of course, were located in Montreal. And lots of times in lots of cases, they'd never been on the ground. They didn't have such things as topographical maps. And they just drew a standard grid pattern, streets running north and south and east and west without any regard for the topography. And of course, in Sudbury, there were 30 lakes within that 2 square mile area. Not only were there lakes, there were swamps, and there were huge rock outcroppings. And here was a street pattern that had been laid out as though it was the prairies. The site for Sudbury was not like the other cities in Canada where somebody said this would make a great place to establish a community. And as a consequence, the physical terrain and the topography and all the rest of it certainly is not very conducive to building roads or sewer or water mains or anything else.
If building on it is tough, and mining it even tougher, why not uncover its inherent beauty? Soon after his arrival in Sudbury as a young man, coming as a sixth-generation stone carver from the north of Italy, Peter Alero realized the art to be extracted from the unforgiving Canadian Shield. Known as one of the world's greatest mineral storehouses, for Peter, and today his son, the wealth in the rock is revealed in its many forms, one example of Sudbury's cultural diversity. Peter, I'm standing here with my mouth open. What is this?
Copper ore from Sudbury.
Right here.
Right here, Sudbury. Creighton is at the biggest spot of copper ore. Nickel, that is at nickel ore. 13 different mines, it can give you supply nickel.
Now you've got a jade here.
That is jade from Quebec. Yeah.
I didn't know there was jade in Canada. It's absolutely beautiful. I want to see how you do this.
I'd like to introduce you my son. Freddie.
Peter?
That is Freddie.
How are you? Freddie, how are you?
Beautiful.
Good to see you. What are you doing here?
Well, I'm working hard at this beaver symbol of Canada.
What is that?
This is Ottawa Valley marble. I'm just putting the finishing touches on it. I've been working at it for a week now. And I've got some logs here in the background, and I'm trying to work on his fur now. And later I'll be sanding it and polishing it.
Then how do you polish that now?
Well, it's a natural procedure. See, in the rock, the hardest the rock is, the better the shine. So in the rock, God already gave it the shine. It's just a matter of getting it out.
Bring him out.
So we use anywhere between 6 or 8 sandpapers, depending on the hardness. Also, the rock dictates a lot to us how the animal is going to look, because as you're carving, you could hit a little fracture, and a piece where you wanted his head to be falls off.
Yeah.
So you got to all of a sudden decide to make him curving the other way where there's still some material. So that's what they call originality.
Does that happen often?
Quite often. That's why no two pieces are alike. We guarantee it.
Vive la Canadienne! The community's residents of French-speaking ancestry make up about 30% of the population of the region today. Père Germain Lemieux, a Jesuit, came to Sudbury 40 years ago to teach. Originally a Gaspésian, he was soon to recognize the cultural threads that were transported from Quebec as rail workers stayed on taking jobs in mining, lumbering, or farming. Preserving folk stories and songs of that ancestry has not only become his devotion, but has gained him recognition. One of his methods, unique in itself, is a written, lyrical vocabulary. Where did this musical writing come from?
J'ai appris ça 7 ou 8 siècles before Christ, avant notre Seigneur. Et vous avez
Father Lemieux's Jesuit training gave him instruction in a method used to train monks in their religious chants.
They were singing Dixit Dominus. Alors j'ai repris le même.
He explained that this particular shorthand he has adapted is a simple way of capturing songs and music that, for the most part, have never been formally recorded, but have been passed along in an oral tradition.
Compliqué, mais qui est très simple. Et que je peux le relire après 30 ans, 35 ans. Je peux relire exactement la même chose que ce que j'ai entendu, surtout les chansons.
Father, could you take any song and write it this way?
Sure.
Science North is not only a symbol of pride for the people of the Sudbury region, but in many respects is a landmark on which to equate future accomplishments. The character of Sudbury was largely molded in its first decade. It was during that period that the lines were formed that cemented the community of today. The lifestyle is directly related to the faith earlier pioneers had in the potential for a permanent, thriving community. Through these years of concentrated development of its mining operations, though, a price was paid. Man has much to learn from his failings. In the case of the Sudbury Basin here, the early practices of burning off the vegetation in search of mineral deposits and the open pit ore roasting led to damage to the surrounding environment. Well, in history, there are many lessons to be learned. In this case, it has led to an interesting challenge that shows a great deal of promise. Restoring to nature that which is hers. Keith Winterhalter is a plant biologist and a professor at Laurentian University who has devoted his experience to reversing a seemingly irreversible environmental problem. Keith, how did these hills get to be so barren?
Well, originally, of course, this was some of the most beautiful red and white pine in the whole province, and about the middle of last century, they opened this area up to logging. In fact, it just happened to coincide with the big fire in Chicago, and a lot of the lumber from here was floated across the lake to rebuild Chicago. In those days, of course, they just took out the big stuff, but then when the Canadian Pacific Railway came through here in the 1980s, the 1880s, that's when they discovered the ore, and they started roasting it in these big open beds. And the fuel for this was some of the smaller wood. So having taken all the big lumber, then they took the smaller stuff.
Okay, wait a minute now. Roasting it in beds. Tell me about that. What does that mean?
Well, they laid great stacks of cordwood on the ground and then stacked the ore, which is a sulfide ore, on top of that. They set it on fire, and when a certain temperature was reached, the ore itself began to burn and drive off some of the sulfur. And these things would burn for several weeks on end. And then once the burning was finished, they'd cool down, then they'd break it up. They had young kids actually breaking up these big lumps of ore, and then they'd ship them off to be smelted. But actually the damage from the roast beds was fairly localized. A lot of people think that's what denuded the whole area, but really it just affected the area around the roast bed. The real permanent damage began when the smelters were built, because it wasn't only sulfur dioxide that went up the stacks. It was small particles of copper and nickel. And so this soil, which had been already denuded of vegetation by logging, getting the logs for the roast beds, the sulfur dioxide killing much of the vegetation, soil erosion, then was acidified and metal contaminated. Of course, the other thing about these rock outcrops, everyone thinks, or most people assume, that they were once covered with soil. Well, I suspect that the blackened parts were not. Here on the Canadian Shield, it's very common to have outcropping rock, and you'll find trees growing in the pockets of soil between them quite happily. So although soil has eroded, in fact the stony surface of this soil, that's an indication that the finer material has washed from the surface and left them.
So what do you have to do now to make this so something will grow in it?
Well, it's actually very, very simple, and like many things, once you discover it, you wonder why you never thought of it before. We just throw some ground-up limestone on it, calcium carbonate, and I mean literally throw. We have gangs of people out here with bags of lime just literally throwing it on the surface of the ground, and because of these stones, they will trap it, and it will work its way into the crevices, and it doesn't wash away. And right away, even if you don't put any seeds on, you will get seeds that grow in naturally, germinating, and within a few years you'll get a cover of birch and poplar seedlings. Now, in actual fact, though, we usually put in some grass and clover seeds also to get things started.
You don't put any topsoil down, nothing like that?
No topsoil at all, no.
So in the next few generations, we'll be having picnics and around open pit mines.
Oh, yes, it's quite possible, yes.
When Sudbury began in 1885, no one knew, nor for many years afterwards had the merest inkling of what it was destined to become. After all, the future was predicated on what prospectors would uncover, what investment would follow in order to exploit the ore, and how long it would last. This insecurity, inherent in any mining camp, weakens the spirit of permanency. This was only overcome with a determination to succeed. It was those who stayed and saw the vision who made it what it is, much as it is the present generation's responsibility to contribute to shaping its future. Sudbury grew, I guess, the way Canada grew, one layer at a time. The ore that Tom Flanagan stumbled on way back then spirited the birth of this community, but Flanagan and his colleagues, Bill Ramsey and Tom Froude, were railway workers, building the national dream. And the railway, which was to unite the country and carry visitors from all over the world, gave impetus to a resource industry that continues to supply the world. And in the midst of all this, evolved this unique community. Another example of who we are and why we are as a nation. I'm Harvey Kirk. That's my call.
Whenever I go, wherever I to that place, I know it'll always be home, home to